If you had to pick, which Catholic saint seems the smartest? What about the bravest? Or the gayest? Hi, I'm Saphael. I have a master's degree in art history and nothing to do with my degree except make YouTube videos. Today, I'm talking about Saint Sebastian and why some people think of him as a gay icon. Of course, most saints are pretty smart and almost all of them are very, very brave, but they're not really known for their gay vibes. So how has Saint Sebastian earned that reputation? Here's the story of Sebastian's life. Don't worry, I'll be quick, and then we'll get to the thoughty paintings. Sebastian was born in or near Milan sometime around the year 255. He eventually moved to Rome, where he became a well-respected soldier for the Roman Emperor Diocletian. But Sebastian had a big secret. He was a Christian. And under the pagan Diocletian, persecution of Christians had resumed in full force after some time of leniency. While Sebastian pretended to be the good model pagan Roman soldier at work, when he was off the clock, he was secretly preaching the gospel, converting people, getting them baptized, and helping people be healed from their illnesses and disabilities with the power of God. But then, someone snitched. The emperor found out that his soldier had been a secret Christian this whole time. So Diocletian had brought him out to a field where he was tied to a pole and shot at with a bunch of arrows until he was so full of arrows that he apparently looked like a hedgehog. A Christian woman named Irene snuck out that night to take his body down so he could be buried, and she discovered that, miracle of miracles, he was alive. She dragged him back to her house and nursed him back to health. Then, pretty much as soon as he was feeling better, he ran back to the emperor and said, "Look at me, I'm still alive, and I'm still a Christian," and the emperor had him beat to death and thrown in a river. And that time he stayed dead. But a different Christian lady went and found his body, and this time she did give him a Christian burial. So what's gay about that story? It's a pretty typical story of a saint's life. Sebastian was a very faithful Christian, and he converted a lot of people to Christianity. He was a conduit for healing miracles. He survived the whole arrow incident. Even when times got pretty tough, he didn't give up his faith. All of that is pretty typical saint stuff. It's actually less about what he did, and more about how other people portrayed him. Fast forward 1,000 years and change to the 1450s. Pretty much all artists working in the Middle Ages and Renaissance had to make stuff for the church or about the church. In the Renaissance, people started to make more paintings about Roman mythology and that kind of thing, but all the churchy stuff was still pretty much the #1 subject matter for most people in Italy, where all the hottest painting was going down. And that was all good, and some really beautiful paintings came out of that. But a lot of the subjects of those paintings were kind of ugly. Or if not that, they were wearing a ton of very modest clothing. In this painting, you have St. John the Evangelist wearing his rags, looking like he's really going through it. And then there's St. Anthony Abbot, who is old and also mad as hell. You've got God, an angel, and the Virgin Mary up top, old, modest, and why are his wings shaped like that? And modest again. All of these figures look exactly like they're supposed to. Serious, pious, contemplative, and not hot at all. And then, in the middle of it all, there's Sebastian, wearing nothing but a loincloth, and he's got abs. He's jutting his little hip out, he has great hair, and he doesn't even look like he's mad. Of course, there are all the arrows, and he is tied to a pole, but he doesn't look nearly as stressed out as he should, given the circumstances. Now, I actually bought and read the English translation of his life story, and I'd like to point out that nowhere in there did it say that he was stripped before the whole arrow incident. To be fair, that could be mentioned in a different version of his life story. The faithful interpretation of this could also be that it's actually a part of his torment, to be put into a humiliating nudity, and also to maximize the effectiveness and pain of getting shot at. However, there is also the fact that either way, they're painting a pretty boy wearing not a lot of clothes, and they are making that choice, because there are a lot of other scenes from his life story that they could choose to paint instead, like Sebastian debating the emperor, Sebastian converting people, Sebastian's actual moment of martyrdom where he's being beaten to death, Sebastian being dragged out of the river. They could also show him with the arrows but still wearing clothes, and everyone would still know who he is. But I guess these scenes aren't quite as visually compelling. And what makes something visually compelling? Abs. It could also be argued that the partial nudity and loincloth situation is a sort of homage to scenes of the crucifixion. After all, one of the ways to demonstrate faith and love for Christ was to honor his suffering by enduring it oneself. Establishing visual similarities between Sebastian and Christ might help the viewer understand the purpose of Sebastian's sacrifice and suffering, as a means to honor Christ's sacrifice and suffering. I believe all of this may also be true, but if we look at the crucifixion scenes that were coming out around this time, Christ is not sexy. He really looks like he's going through it, and of course he is. The purpose of these paintings is to emphasize the sacrifice and suffering I mentioned a minute ago. Look at how gaunt he is, and all the blood and the wounds. The tone is somber, it's sad, it's scary. He's not doing a saucy little pose up there. He is having a bad time. Unlike Sebastian, shot full of arrows, who seems not so bothered and like he might be feeling kinda cute. Here's the thing. If you wanted to spend some time looking at scantily clad, pretty young men, you didn't have a lot of options. So these images served as devotional images, but to a degree, they were sort of like the Calvin Klein ads of the 1400s. A Calvin Klein ad serves the purpose of showing people a product. It uses the image of an attractive gentleman to do so. These Saint Sebastian paintings serve the purpose of showing people the glory of God. They also use the image of an attractive gentleman to do so. Whether anyone has any ulterior motives in looking at any of these ads, it is easy to imagine. And because he is not as holy as Christ, Saint Sebastian is a much easier vehicle for this kind of flirty art than Jesus would be. Of course, women also looked at these paintings if they were displayed publicly in a church, but I'm talking about men here because these paintings were all made by men. Men made the decision to paint this subject in this way. There isn't much reason to believe that Saint Sebastian himself was actually gay. It's all about the vibes of the artists when painting him. Another interesting tidbit is the decline of paintings of Saint Sebastian in the later part of the 15th century and into the 16th century. While paintings of this subject continued to be made, interest in Greco-Roman subject matter increased and became more acceptable in the mainstream during the Renaissance. This provided other non-biblical and non-churchy stories for artists to use as an excuse to make images of naked people. For example, the famous birth of Venus. This is a story from mythology and also a reason to paint attractive naked people. As this kind of subject matter increased, the amount of naked Sebastians gradually decreased. Of course, it never went completely out of style. Artists such as Il Sodoma, which directly translates to the sodomite, continued to paint Sebastian. And even as the number of these paintings decreased, the interest in the subject matter lingered into the present day, especially among gay people. The English professor Dr. Richard A. Kay wrote an article which explored some of the recent history of queer fascination with Saint Sebastian. He includes a quote from the early 20th century German sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld, who was essentially pro-gay, but he used the language of the time in this quote. Hirschfeld said that the paintings of Sebastian were, quote, in the first rank of artworks in which the invert takes special delight. In 1983, the French writer Michel de Castillo wrote about Sebastian, generations of smitten young men in the secret of their hearts, in their very being, have been caressed by the look and touch of his muscles. Kay also cites the inclusion of the figure of Saint Sebastian in the famous book Confessions of a Mask by the Japanese novelist Yukio Mishima, in the context of the protagonist's homosexual sexual awakening. So, it's clear that there is an actual history of a real association between Saint Sebastian and gay people. But is it just because Saint Sebastian is ripped and pretty? In the 20th century, we gained access to revolutionary new technologies such as photography that made images of attractive young men available in forms other than old-timey religious paintings. There are actual Calvin Klein ads now, and they're free to look at. Dr. Kay mentions one important thematic element from Saint Sebastian's story, that of secrecy and persecution. There are many easy parallels that can be drawn between Sebastian's story as a closeted Christian, who was outed with violent and tragic consequences, and that of many gay people. On top of that, Sebastian was a patron saint of disease, because in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, catching the plague was compared to being struck by an arrow. This adds another layer of meaning for the many gay men who lived during the AIDS epidemic. In the early 1980s, before much was known about the disease, it was sometimes referred to as the gay plague, because of how it was first primarily observed in young homosexual men. From 1987 to 1996, over 324,000 people died from AIDS in the United States. And because the primary victims were gay men and intravenous drug users, already marginalized populations, the government provided little to no assistance. This plague directly or indirectly affected the lives of all gay people living during this time. There are also many valid critiques of the idea of Saint Sebastian as some kind of gay icon. Why should gay people be expected to identify with suffering? Why should they be expected to identify with a random, mostly nude male body? And then there's the issue of the Catholic Church. There's pretty much an unlimited number of valid criticisms of the institution of the Catholic Church, which include the Church's historic and ongoing homophobia. The Church has caused a lot of harm to LGBT people, and its official doctrine has been, and continues to be, homophobic and transphobic. There is also an element of hypocrisy, with members of the clergy who have attained a large amount of power sometimes taking male lovers, even as they continue to perpetuate homophobic doctrines and ideas among their parishioners. This is to say nothing of the many other heinous crimes committed by those in power in the Church behind closed doors, particularly the sexual abuse of minors, while condemning consensual homosexual relationships between adults. Saint Sebastian is a representative of this institution. Many gay people do not want to identify with or claim any representative of that institution. However, despite the amount of harm the Church has caused to the LGBT community, there are many queer people who still identify with some of the other messaging of the Church, or who have emotional or cultural ties to it, who may find the idea of a gay saint healing. When I see Saint Sebastian, I see an amalgamation of the thoughts and desires and fears of the artists who painted him. I see a figure who may have served as an outlet and a refuge for men in the 15th century, who had virtually no options outside of the Catholic Church, and very few options within it. I understand that this video probably comes off as insanely blasphemous and heretical, but my purpose is not to comment on the religious figures themselves or anyone's faith. I'm here to talk about art and the cultural legacy of the Italian Renaissance. Jesus Christ was the holiest top dog, and people were a little bit more cautious about what they prayed to him about and how they portrayed him. Saints, however, were within reach. Instead of being from a distant, mystical holy land like Nazareth, many of them were from cities like Milan, which, from the perspective of a Renaissance Italian, might have been just the town over, or the place where their cousin Vinny lives, or where they go shopping. Saint Sebastian was a religious figure to these people, but also someone they could more easily identify with than Christ. And some of the people who identified with him might have been gay. Personally, I think the question of whether he was a gay icon is kind of arbitrary. The legacy of Saint Sebastian in art and queer Renaissance history will never be disentangled. But it's fun to ponder. At least that's what I think. If you liked this video, please feel free to subscribe. This is the first video I have ever made, so my goal is to get to 5 subs by the end of the month. If there are any art history topics you'd like me to cover, please let me know in the comments. I have something very special planned for next time, but I am open to ideas. Until next time, keep thinking.